The sun beat down like judgment as the cowboy rode in alone, a shadow stretching from his mule's hooves across the cracked dust of the main street. His hat sagged with wear, his coat flapped at the sleeves, and a limp turned his stride into a slow drag, each step more echo than motion. Beside him padded a dog, lean as a fence rail, one ear torn and one eye milked by an old scar. The townsfolk didn't speak. They watched. They always watched when the wounded came too close. The town of Grady's Bluff had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than a grave waiting to happen. Storefronts were boarded, signs swung by rusted nails, and at the center of it all, like a cracked tooth in the town's crooked smile, stood the saloon. Jed Marlowe didn't plan to stay long. He never did. He came for a drink, maybe a hot scrap of food if luck favored him, but mostly he came because Boone needed water. The dog had limped 40 miles with him and hadn't let out a single whine. They didn't speak much, never needed. 2. But Boone's presence was the only thing that still tethered Jed to something like life. Inside the saloon, smoke hung low and the piano stood silent. Cards clacked, boots scraped, and every head turned when Jed entered. Not for him, but for what was happening at the far end of the room. They were auctioning women. 6 of them stood near the back wall, skirts torn, wrists bound in rope too tight for comfort. Their eyes flicked across the crowd, gauging which leer might cost them the most. A man in a dark vest raised a dirty hand and called, "Next lot!" Jed didn't move, but Boone growled low. It was a sound like gravel shifting under a wagon's wheel, quiet but heavy with warning. The next lot was no older than 16, her face pale under the layers of trail dust. A small dog, a pup, barely weaned, trembled in her arms. Jed looked to the bar, but his boots refused to turn. The man running the auction, broad-shouldered and scar-laced, caught sight of him. "Well, look what the desert dragged in," sneered. "A hobbled relic with a mutt. You shopping, stranger? We got all types." The room chuckled. Jed's eyes didn't waver. His voice came out flat. "She don't belong on that block." "Neither do you," came the reply, fast and sharp. "But here we are." Boone stepped forward, baring his teeth. A man near the door reached for his rifle. Jed raised a hand, not to stop Boone, but to steady the storm rising in his gut. He had seen things that couldn't be forgotten, had buried things that should have never died. But this was something different. "How much?" he asked. Laughter echoed. "You buying or preaching, old man?" the scarred leader asked. "Coin don't matter unless you want to play by the rules." Jed reached into his coat. The bar went quiet, but instead of a pistol, he pulled out a worn leather pouch and dropped it on a nearby table. Coins spilled, like blood across wood. "All I've got," he said. "You sure?" the man asked, tone narrowing like a knife's edge. "You winner, you walk out with a burden. You lose." He glanced down at Boone. "We take the dog too." Boone didn't flinch. Jed didn't blink. "I win," Jed said. "She walks. The dog stays with me." A grin split the man's face like a wound. 3 trials. Win 'em, and she's yours. Lose. He spread his arms. "Well, hell, it'll be a story for the rest of us." Jed nodded once. Boone gave a quiet, gruff huff and stepped in beside him. The crowd murmured with renewed interest, like buzzards sensing something fresh in the sand. The girl held her dog tighter. Her lip trembled, but behind that fear, there was a flicker of something else. Hope. And Jed, tired, bitter, half-broken, felt something shift deep in the marrow of his bones. He didn't know the girl's name. He didn't need to. She was someone's daughter. Someone's entire world. He had lost his once. He wouldn't lose this one too. The saloon doors creaked again behind him as more men filtered in, drawn by the noise. But Jed never looked back. He only stepped forward. The first trial took place out back, in the dust behind the saloon, where the sun had baked the earth into something brittle and cruel. A ring had been drawn with the toe of a boot, and men circled it like wolves waiting for a kill. Jed stepped into it without ceremony. Boone waited just outside the line, ears back, hackles raised. The challenge was simple, if you believed the man who grinned while announcing it. Beat two younger, faster men in a bare-knuckle bout. No weapons, no time limit. First one on the E. Ground for more than a count of 5 lost. Jed flexed his fingers, bones creaking like old saddle leather. Across from him, the two boys looked barely old enough to shave, but they had the eyes of men raised on violence, boys who'd learned cruelty before they ever knew kindness. One spat and cracked his knuckles. The other smiled without warmth. "You could walk," the grinning announcer offered again. "No shame in admitting you're too broken for this." Jed didn't respond. He hadn't come to be understood. He came to save a girl who should have never known cages. The first boy lunged. Jed sidestepped, let the punch whistle past, then drove his elbow into the boy's ribs. The crack was sharp, but the boy stayed upright. The second came in hot, faster than the first, and landed a jab across Jed's jaw. It snapped his head sideways, but not his footing. Pain blossomed, quick and electric, but Jed had lived with worse. He took a step back, then another, forcing them to come to him. Dust clouded around their boots, his lungs burned, the heat pressed down like a yoke. The second boy rushed again, sloppy, eager to finish it. That was his mistake. Jed pivoted low, caught him by the belt, and used the boy's own speed to hurl him out of the circle. The crowd roared. One down. The first boy hesitated now. Jed saw the flicker of doubt bloom in his eyes. "You want out?" Jed asked, voice low. The boy shook his head, more out of pride than sense. He came forward, fists raised high. Jed waited, then struck fast. 2 body shots, then one to the chin. The boy dropped to one knee, gasping. Dust clung to his sweat. 1. Someone began counting. The boy tried to rise, got 1 foot under him, then collapsed again. 5! The crowd shouted. Jed stepped back. Blood ran from his lip, and a rib throbbed like something was cracked. But he was still standing. The announcer scowled and gave a slow, theatrical clap. "Impressive," he drawled. "Didn't think you'd last that long." Boone wagged his tail once, then sat again, watching. The girl, still inside the saloon with the others, had seen it all through the back window. She didn't smile, but she stared at Jed like he'd broken through some invisible wall she'd forgotten could fall. The second trial came an hour later, and it wasn't a fight. It was a test of aim. A row of empty whiskey bottles stood along a broken fence, sun glinting off the glass. Jed was handed a 6-shooter with only 3 bullets. He had to hit all 3 moving targets, bottles swinging from rope, dancing in the wind. Jed hadn't touched a gun in weeks, not since the last grave he'd dug. The wind picked up, curling, dust across his boots. Boone sat beside him, eyes forward, as if he too understood what hung in the balance. Jed took his stance, narrowed his eyes, and raised the revolver. The first shot rang out. Glass exploded, shards scattering like ice in the sun. He exhaled. The second shot hit just off center, but was enough to shatter the second bottle clean. 1 bullet left. The last bottle spun hardest. It danced erratically, tugged by a playful gust, almost mocking. Jed waited, counted in his head. Let the world go quiet. Then fired. The bottle exploded in a perfect storm of light and glass. The crowd murmured. Not with surprise, this wasn't luck. This was something older, quieter. A man who'd trained not for show, but survival. The announcer licked his lips, clearly disappointed. "Guess you're luckier than you look." Jed didn't answer. He holstered the pistol, the weight of it unfamiliar. Then came the third trial, the one no one could prepare for. The announcer led Jed and Boone to the far edge of town, where a narrow canyon sliced the earth like a scar. They stopped near a crate covered in canvas. A low whimpering came from inside. "Last test," the D man said. "That little pup the girl's been hiding? Its legs broke. If you want her to walk free, you've got to fix him." Jed frowned. "I'm no doctor." "No," the man replied. "But if you care enough, you'll try." He left them there, alone. Jed knelt, peeled back the canvas, and found the pup. Shaking, one leg clearly twisted wrong, eyes wild with pain. Boone stepped closer and gently licked the pup's face. The whimpering eased just a little. Jed looked around, found 2 flat sticks, stripped his own sleeve for cloth. He spoke softly as he worked, voice steady. "I know it hurts, little fella, but you're not alone." He splinted the leg with care, wrapping it slow, keeping his hands gentle even as the pup yelped. Boone lay beside them, a quiet guardian. By the time Jed finished, the pup was breathing steadier. His eyes, though still wet with pain, had softened. He didn't try to bite. He trusted. Jed sat back, blood on his hands, and looked toward the canyon wall. The sun was dipping now. The light was turning gold. Behind him, boots crunched on gravel. The announcer returned, saw the pup nestled between Jed's knees, bandaged and sleeping. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he nodded, once. Jed had passed. From the saloon, a girl ran barefoot down the path, her small dog yipping at her heels. She didn't say thank you. She just grabbed Jed's hand and held it. And for the first time in years, Jed didn't pull away. Nightfall painted Grady's Bluff in shadows and quiet, the kind that made every creak feel like a whisper from the past. Jed sat with his back against the saloon's outer wall, bandaging his knuckles with what little cloth he had left. Boone lay stretched beside him, ears twitching at the wind's soft stir. The girl, May, she'd finally said, sat a few feet away with her pup curled against her chest. She hadn't let go of him since the trials ended. She wasn't talking much. Neither was Jed. Words weren't needed right now. Sometimes silence was the only language the broken understood. Inside, voices still murmured, but the crowd had thinned. Those who'd come hoping for a show had gotten more than they bargained for. A stranger who didn't back down. A girl who didn't cry. And a town that had remembered, if only briefly, what it meant to bear witness to decency. The man who ran. The auction hadn't spoken since the final test. He just faded into the crowd like smoke, the grin wiped from his face. Maybe he'd underestimated the weight of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Jed hadn't come to play hero. He hadn't come to rescue anyone. He barely remembered what it meant to care for himself. But now May sat beside him, humming low to soothe her pup, and Boone dozed with his head resting on Jed's boot. Something had shifted. Something small, but unshakable. May finally broke the silence. "He's gonna be okay, isn't he?" Jed looked at the pup. "He's got fight in him. That's what counts." She nodded, rubbing the dog's ears. "I didn't think anyone would stop them. The men. They'd been doing this for weeks." Sheriff turned his face, said it wasn't his job to deal with commerce. Her voice trembled at the word. Jed's jaw tightened. He stared out into the darkness. It's always someone's job. Folks just forget. A long pause followed. Then she said quietly, "They killed my brother when he tried to stop them." Her fingers gripped the dog a little tighter. "Told me they'd sell me next." Jed looked over. Not with pity, just steady. "You're not for sale. Not anymore." She didn't cry. Instead, she leaned her head against the wall, eyes still on the stars that had begun to stitch the sky. "Where will you go now?" He didn't have an answer. not one he liked. "I was heading west," he said. "Didn't have a reason, just kept moving." May studied him for a moment, then said, "You could stay, or we could go with you." Jed blinked. That caught him sideways. "You and the pup?" "And Boone, if he'll have me." She smiled, small but real. Boone gave a soft grunt, in his sleep, as if giving his answer. Jed didn't speak. He didn't need to. He stood slowly, offered her his hand. May looked at it like it was something sacred, then placed her small hand in his. She rose with him, the pup nestled in one arm. They walked to the edge of town together. Behind them, the saloon faded into shadow, the lights inside flickering low. No one followed, no one called them back. As they passed the church, long abandoned, shutters broken and steeple leaning, Jed paused. Someone had lit a candle in the window. Faint, flickering. Maybe someone else had watched. Maybe someone else remembered what it meant to hope. The road west was dark, but they followed it anyway. Boone led the way, his limp barely noticeable now. The girl walked tall, even if her feet were bare. And Jed carried something he hadn't in years. Not just a gun or a scar, but purpose. They didn't speak of the past, didn't need to. All that mattered was the fire behind them had gone out, and ahead the wind carried the scent of rain. Not a storm, but something clean, something new. And for the first time since he buried his wife and left the world behind, Jed Marlowe let himself believe in something like peace. Not perfect, not painless, but earned and shared, one step at a time.